Wyoming Territory, 1871, and the wind came down off the Big Horns the way it did in late September, clean and cold and carrying the first true word of the winter that was still 6 weeks out, but had already whitened the high peaks and sent the elk drifting lower. Tate Renslow rode a line no one else had reason to ride. He was 38 years old, and he lived 9 miles above the last cabin on Sweetwater Creek, further out than any sane man wintered, in a place he had built himself out of lodgepole and river stone over 4 years of summers. He came down to Ferris twice a season for flour and powder and coffee, and the town called him the Mountain Man, and the children called him worse. And Tate Renslow did not correct any of them, because he had learnt in the war that a man who explains himself is a man who is asking to be understood, and he had stopped asking for that a long time ago. He talked to his horse. He talked to the 2 mules. He had not said 50 words to another human being since the thaw. The wagon stood in the middle of the lander cut off with its tongue down and one wheel dished, and it had been there a while. Tate saw the buzzards first, 3 of them, wheeling low and patient over the draw, and he came up on the wagon slow with his rifle out of the boot and across his knees, because a wagon standing empty on a dead stretch of trail was a thing a careful man read twice before he rode into it. There was a mule down in the traces, long dead. There was no other animal. There was a spill of household goods down the tailgate, as though somebody had gone through it in a hurry, and a woman's shoe in the grass, and no woman. And there was a sound coming out of the wagon bed that Tate Renslow had not heard in 11 years, and had hoped never to hear again, because the last time he had heard it, it had been his own, a baby crying thin and worn out with it, the particular cry of a child that has been crying a long time and has stopped expecting anybody to come. She was maybe 4 months old, wrapped in a good wool shawl gone stiff with the cold, in a nest of quilts in the bed of that wagon, and she had been alone long enough that her cry had gone to a rasp. There was a note pinned to the shawl. It was written in pencil, in a hand that had been taught to write and then not had much cause to, and it had been rained on and dried once so the letters had bled, and it said 4 words. "She's yours now. Please." That was all. No name, no date, no account of who or why or where the woman had gone, whether taken or dead, or simply walked off into the sage past the point where walking back was a thing a person could do. Tate Renslow stood in the wind on the lander cut off and turned that note over twice looking for the rest of it, and there was no rest of it. He was not the child's father. He knew that with the plain certainty of a man who had been 9 miles up Sweetwater Creek and inside nobody's confidence for 4 years. Whoever had written please had written it to no one, had pinned it to a shawl, and left it for the first rider God sent down that cut off, and had chosen those 4 words because they were the only 4 that might make a stranger stop. They made him stop. He stood there a long while. A careful man could ride on. A careful man could ride to Ferris and tell the marshal there was a wagon on the cutoff and a foundling in it, and let the town do what towns did with foundlings, which was the county home at Rawlins, and a careful man would have a clear conscience about it, because he had reported the thing to the proper authority. Tate Renslow had watched the proper authority work at a place called the county home once, as a boy, from the inside, for 2 years after the fever took his people. He knew exactly what was down that road. He took his coat off in the cold wind, and he wrapped the child in it against his own body where the warmth was, and he buttoned it, and the crying eased against him the way it will when a small thing finds heat and a heartbeat at the same time. He gathered the shawl and the quilts and the note. He looked once more down the sage in every direction, in case, and there was nothing but wind. Then he mounted, one-handed, the child inside his coat, and he turned the horse north, up toward the Big Horns and the 9 miles and the winter. And he did not look back at the wagon, and he did not look back at the cutoff, and there were those in Ferris who said afterward that Tate Renslow rode down out of the mountains that autumn a mountain man and rode back up a father, and never once in between stopped to decide it, because it had already been decided the moment he read 4 words in a bled pencil hand. He named her Winter because it was coming, and because she had come to him at the edge of it, and because a man who lives alone names things plainly. The cabin at the head of Sweetwater Creek had 1 room and a loft and a stone hearth that drew well, and it had never in 4 years held anything softer than a wolf pelt, and Tate Renslow spent the first night of his fatherhood discovering that he did not know one single thing about keeping a 4-month-old child alive. He knew cattle. He knew a foaling mare and an orphaned calf, and it was the orphaned calf that saved Winter's life, because a man who has pulled a bum calf through on a rag and a bucket knows that a young thing takes milk warm and slow and often, and he had a milk cow wintering in the low shed for his own coffee, and he warmed her milk and thinned it and fed it to the child off the corner of a boiled rag through the whole of that first night, drop by drop, the way he had once fed a calf, talking to her the entire time in the low even voice he used on frightened animals, about the snow coming, and the wood he had laid in, and the long dark ahead, and how the 2 of them would get through it. By morning she had kept it down and slept. He made a cradle out of a hollowed half log, the way the Shoshone made them, because he had seen it done, and it was sound. He cut down a wool shirt for gowns. He learnt, badly and then well, the things a mother learns, and he learnt them alone, 9 miles above the last cabin, with the first snow closing the pass behind him for the winter 3 days after he carried her in. And on the wall by the door, on a nail, he hung a small thing he made that first week out of the lid of a bean can, cut with his knife into a 5-pointed star and rubbed bright, because a child ought to have something to look at that caught the firelight, and because his own father, dead 30 years, had worn a deputy's star in a Missouri town, and it was the one thing Tate Renslow had left of the man. The memory of a tin star catching lamplight, and he found he wanted his daughter to grow up with the same thing catching hers. She learnt to reach for it before she learnt to crawl. The winter was 5 months long, and the 2 of them were snowed in for the worst 4 of it, and it was, Tate Renslow would say at the very end of his life, the finest season he ever lived. He was not a man who had expected to be happy. He had come up Sweetwater Creek to be left alone by a world that had taken his people, and then taken his war years, and given him nothing back but the knowledge of how to survive without anyone. And he had built survival into a whole life, and called it enough, because there was nothing to measure it against. Winter gave him something to measure it against. By the thaw she knew his voice, and his step, and the particular sound of him coming in from the shed with the cold on him. And she laughed at the fire, and she had a fistful of his beard whenever he came near enough. And Tate Renslow, who had not been touched in kindness by another living soul in a decade, discovered that he had been starving and had not known the name of the hunger. When the pass opened in the spring, he rode down to Ferris with the child on his chest in a Shoshone cradleboard, and the town looked at the mountain man with a baby and did not know what to make of it, and he told them the truth in as few words as he could, because he had thought about it all winter and decided that the truth held better than any lie he could build. He told the marshal about the wagon on the cutoff, and the note, and the 4 words, and he gave the marshal the note to copy into his book against the day somebody came looking. And he said, plainly in front of the store and half the town, that the child was his now, that he would raise her, and that any man or woman who cared to make something of it could ride 9 miles up Sweetwater and say it to his face. Nobody rode up Sweetwater. Before the trouble found the man and the child at the head of that creek, and it would, though it took 11 years to do it, there were those 11 years, and they were good ones, and a story that only told the finding would be leaving out the part that mattered most, which was the raising. If you have stayed with this story so far, stay a while longer. What comes next is the part that turns it, and turns it hard. And if a tale of a solitary man made whole by the thing he did not go looking for speaks to you, the bell beneath this story is how we keep meeting like this. Trouble came in the person of a cattleman named Bishop Aldous, who ran 4,000 head in the valley below Sweetwater, and had run them there for 20 years, and who had wanted the head of that creek for water the whole time. Tate Renslow's cabin sat on the only year-round spring above the valley, and in a dry country a year-round spring is worth more than gold and lasts longer, and Bishop Aldous had offered to buy it 4 times over 11 years, and had 4 times been told no, in one word, at the door, by a man who did not raise his voice. In the dry summer of 1882, Winter 11 years old by then, and reading and writing, and able to set a snare and read weather and do her letters at the plank table by the fire, Bishop Aldous stopped asking. He came up Sweetwater with his foreman and a paper and a story, and the story was this, that Tate Renslow had no legal claim to the land he squatted on, which was true, because Tate had never filed, because filing meant a trip to the land office at Cheyenne and a winter's cash he had never once had to spare, and that Bishop Aldous had filed on it himself that spring in Cheyenne and held the paper, and that the mountain man and his half-wild girl had until the first snow to be off land that now belonged, by the law of the territory, to the Aldous Range. "I got no quarrel with you, Renslow," Bishop Aldous said, from his horse, not getting down. "You built a nice place. But you built it on ground you never troubled to put your name to, and I troubled to put mine, and that's the whole of it. The law's the law. You've squatted 11 years on borrowed time, and the note's come due." Tate Renslow stood in his own doorway with his daughter behind him, and the tin star bright on its nail beside them both, and he said the longest thing anybody in Ferris had heard him say in 11 years. "That's my spring, Aldous. I found it, and I cleared it, and I've watered off it 11 years. And there's a girl inside can read and cipher and knows every foot of this mountain. And she was left to die in a wagon on the Lander cutoff, and I did not let her. And I am not going to stand here and let you take the roof off her the same way somebody once took it off me. You filed a paper. All right. I'll see you at Cheyenne, and I'll bring my own." Bishop Aldous smiled, because he had 11 years of no, and a filed deed, and a foreman with a rifle, and a squatter with no paper and a child was not, in his long experience of the territory, a thing that won at Cheyenne. Winter Renslow was 11 years old, and she had grown up knowing exactly what kind of man her father was, and she had grown up knowing one other thing besides, which was the whole of her own story, because Tate Renslow had never once hidden it from her. He had told her about the wagon when she was old enough to ask. He had shown her the note, "She's yours now, please," in the lead pencil hand kept flat in the family Bible that was the only book in the cabin, besides the 2 he had bought her to learn on. He had told her he was not her blood father, and had told it to her plainly and young, so that it could never one day be used against either of them as a secret. And he had told her the 4 words, and he had told her that 4 words from a stranger had made him a father in the time it took to read them, and that he had never once, from that minute to this, wished it undone. She knew, therefore, 2 things that Bishop Aldous did not know she knew. She knew that the note existed, and was witnessed, and was copied into the marshal's book at Ferris 11 years before, dated, with her father's sworn account of the finding beside it. And she knew, because she read everything, because a snowed-in child reads the whole of everything there is that her father had, without ever quite understanding what he had, a claim of his own. 11 years of continuous, open, improved occupation. A cabin, a barn, cleared land, a dug spring house, a fenced pasture. She had read the phrase in a 2-year-old newspaper that had come up wrapped around the coffee, and she had asked her father what it meant, and he had not known, and she had kept it in her head the way she kept everything. The word was homestead, and under the law of the territory, a man who had lived on and improved public land for the required years had a right to file on it that came before any stranger's paper. A right the law called preemption, if only he could prove the years. Her father could not prove the years. He had no witnesses that a court would hear, being a man nobody visited, but the marshal at Ferris had a note in his book, dated the autumn of 1871 in Tate Renslow's own account, placing him at the head of Sweetwater Creek with a foundling child 11 years before Bishop Aldous ever rode to Cheyenne. The thing that could save the land was the same thing that had made her his daughter. She did not tell her father her whole plan, because she was 11 and afraid he would ride to Cheyenne and lose, and because she had worked out something he had not, which was that the fight was not really at Cheyenne at all. The fight was at Ferris, in a book, in front of the town. The trouble came to a head before the snow, the way trouble does. Bishop Aldous did not wait for Cheyenne. On a night in October his foreman and 2 hands rode up Sweetwater and fired the barn, meaning to burn a stubborn squatter down to the point where leaving looked easier than staying, and it very nearly worked, because the barn went up fast in the dry, and the milk cow was in it, and Tate Renslow ran into a burning barn for the cow, because a man who has wintered on that cow's milk does not let her burn, and a beam came down. It caught him across the back and the leg, and it put him on the ground under falling fire, and it was Winter Renslow, 11 years old, who got him out, who backed the terrified cow through the broken end of the barn with a horse blanket over its head, and then went back into the smoke for her father, and got a lead rope around his shoulders, and hitched the other end to the plow horse she had bridled in the dark, and drove that horse forward one slow step at a time until her father came out of the fire and into the yard, burned and broken-legged but breathing. The Aldous hands were gone. They had not stayed to see it. That was the thing that undid Bishop Aldous in the end, that his men had fired a barn with a child in the yard and ridden off, and one of them, a 19-year-old named Polly, who had not known there was a child up there, could not live with it, and rode into Ferris 4 days later, and told the marshal the whole of it. Winter Renslow got her father down the mountain on a travois she built herself, the way she had seen it drawn in a book, and she got him to Ferris, and she got the doctor, and while the doctor set the leg she went to the marshal's office, and she asked to see the book. The marshal was a man named Cobb, and he had been marshal at Ferris 11 years, and he remembered perfectly well the day the mountain man had come down out of the Big Horns with a foundling on his chest and given him a note to copy, because it was the strangest thing that had happened in Ferris in 20 years, and he had told the story at his own supper table a dozen times. "It's here, girl," said Cobb, turning the book to the autumn of 1871. "Right here. His own words. The wagon, the note, you in it, the date. I copied it that spring, and I witnessed it, and I've had it 11 years. Then it proves he was on the mountain in 1871, said Winter Renslow, 11 years old, standing very straight in the marshal's office. 11 years before Mr. Aldous filed his paper in Cheyenne, and I have read that the law gives a man who has lived on and worked public land the first right to file on it, before any stranger, if he can prove the years. She put her small hand flat on the open book. That is the proof of the years, Marshal Cobb. It has been sitting in your book the whole time. My father did not know it was there, and Mr. Aldous did not know it was there, and it was put there by the same thing that made me his, a note that said she's yours now, and a man who stopped to read it. Marshal Cobb looked at the book, and then at the child, for a long moment. Aldous fired that barn with you in the yard, he said slowly. Yes, sir, and one of his men will say so. He is sitting in your jail right now, Marshal, having said so, and I would ask you to write down what I have just shown you in the book, and date it, in front of witnesses, before Mr. Aldous hears that Polly talked and rides to Cheyenne to file something new. It went the way she said it would, because she had read enough to know how these things went, and because the town, when it finally looked, did not like what it saw. The county held its inquiry at Ferris in November, in the church, because there was no courthouse, and the whole town came, because arson and a burned man and an 11-year-old girl who dragged her father out of a fire were more than Ferris could stay away from. Bishop Aldous had his file deed from Cheyenne, and his lawyer, and his 20 years in the valley. He did not have the years on the mountain, and the marshal's book had them, dated 11 years back in Tate Renslow's own hand, which no man could have forged 11 years before he needed it, which was the whole strength of it. And he did not have his own hands, because young Polly stood up in the church and told, white and shaking, how he had ridden up Sweetwater in the dark to fire a barn, and had not known until he saw a child running through the smoke that there was a little girl on that mountain at all, and how he had ridden off and left her to it, and had not slept since. And Tate Renslow, on a bench at the front with his legs splinted, and his hands and face still marked from the fire, said the second longest thing anybody in Ferris ever heard him say, which was that he had squatted on that spring for 11 years because he had never had a winter's cash to spare for the ride to Cheyenne, and that this was true and he would not pretend otherwise, but that his daughter had been left to die in a wagon on the Lander Cutoff in the autumn of 1871, and he had carried her up that mountain the same week, and that if the law of the territory meant to say a man who had done that and lived there openly for 11 years had less claim than a stranger who filed a paper in the spring, then he would abide by it. But he did not believe the law meant to say any such thing, and he did not believe the good people of Ferris meant to let it. The good people of Ferris did not mean to let it. The county found for Tate Renslow. His years were proved out of the marshal's own book, his preemption claim held against the Aldous filing, and the land at the head of Sweetwater Creek was patented to him at last with his own name on the paper, filed that winter, with money the town of Ferris raised without being asked, in a jar on the store counter, because a town that has watched a girl drag her father out of a fire, finds it, wants to be part of the ending. Bishop Aldous was not hanged, and was not even charged for the fire, because the law could not quite reach a man for what his hired hands had done on his unspoken word. But young Polly's account was in the marshal's book, dated, beside the 11-year-old note, and the valley heard the whole of it, and a cattleman whose men fire barns with children in the yard is a cattleman whose neighbors stopped lending him a hand at branding and stopped selling him hay in a hard winter. And Bishop Aldous sold out in 2 years and went to Montana, and the valley below Sweetwater watered off Tate Renslow's spring by his own free leave for the rest of his life, which was the thing Aldous had tried to take and could have simply asked for. Tate Renslow's leg mended crooked, and he walked with a stick the rest of his days, and he counted it a fair price, and he said so. Winter Renslow grew up. She had the whole of her story, and she never once wished for a different one. She learnt her letters, and then a great deal more than her letters, and she went down to the school at Ferris, and then, at 17, to the normal school at Cheyenne, on money her father found by selling off the far pasture to the valley men, who were glad to buy it, and gladder to have a reason to give him more than it was worth. And she came back to Ferris a schoolteacher, and taught in the little school where she had learnt, and taught a good many children of the same town that had once called her father the mountain man, and worse. She married, at 22, a widowed rancher from the valley named Owen Marsh, who had a small boy and a great gentleness in him, and a way of not needing to be the loudest man in a room, and she chose him, her father always said, because she had grown up knowing exactly what a good quiet man looked like, and would not be talked into settling for less. She brought her husband and her stepson up Sweetwater Creek to live, because she would not leave her father to winter alone again, and the cabin that had held 1 man and then a man and a baby held 4, and then 5, and then 6, over the years. Tate Renslow lived to be 79 up the head of Sweetwater Creek, and he died in the spring in his own bed, with his daughter's hand in his, and 3 grandchildren in the yard, and the last thing he said they always told it was that it had been a good winter. There is a grave under the lodge poles above the spring, and there is a marker on it that Winter Marsh cut herself, being her father's daughter and able to do a thing with a knife, and it does not say much, because he would not have wanted much said. It says his name, and the years, and under them 4 words, because 4 words had been enough to make him a father, and she could think of no better 4 to send him off with. She's yours now. Please, and on a nail by the door of the cabin, where it is hung for going on 60 years, and hangs there yet, there is a small 5-pointed star cut from the lid of a bean can, rubbed bright by a man's thumb, and then a girl's, and then a whole run of children's, catching the firelight the way it caught it the first winter, when a solitary man who talked to his horses more than to people warmed a stranger's child drop by drop off a boiled rag and did not once, from that night to the end of his long life, look back. If your heart has ever leaned toward a story where a man found the whole of his life in the one thing he never went looking for, a child in a wagon, 4 words in a bled pencil hand, and a winter that turned a stranger into a father, then this story was for you. Out on the cold slopes of the Big Horns, where the wind keeps the only memory of what was, the love between Tate Renslow and the daughter he named for the season became the kind that does not need anyone to remember it to be real, though a whole town remembered and raised a jar of coins to prove it. If stories of frontier love, the love of a father made whole, the courage of a girl who dragged him out of the fire, speak to you, follow the lonesome trail for more. Here the love stories are quiet, the courage is real, and the last word is always worth the wait. Until the next trail.